Welcome to my channel. Today we will meet the woman who was the matriarch of the Plantagenet family. She is one of the most formidable women of the 12th century. But there was another royal lady whose influence over her family and kingdom was equally great. And today we will be looking at her life. And it is her descendants who were known as the Plantagenets, who would go on to rule England for more than 300 years. And she was even nicknamed the Lady of the English. And if you look around, you'll see that many queens of England were born in that year. Now, when she was born, she was given the name Matilda, but she was also known by the nickname Maud, which is a diminutive of Matilda, and some historians use those two names interchangeably. However, for clarity's sake, we are going to refer to her as Matilda. For example, she returned to England in 1124 to attend the royal wedding of her cousin, King Stephen of England, and his wife, Matilda of Boulogne. So Henry I decided to break with tradition and named his daughter, Matilda, as his heir presumptive, meaning that she was first in line to the throne. After hearing about Stephen's death, the barons came to Matilda and asked her to swear an oath that she would not try to claim the throne if anything happened to her father. She agreed and swore to abide by whatever decision they made. And then, as they were taking the oath, she said, "God damn the barons," which is pretty sassy if you ask me. The war was brutal and resulted in thousands of deaths, so she earned the nickname Lady of the English for that. But in 1153, recognizing that he was nearing the end of his life and that his choice of heirs would likely lead to another civil war, he made peace with Matilda and made her the Marchioness of England, and then finally agreed to marry her to his cousin, Geoffrey, the son of the former King Henry II. And these two would go on to have 5 children together, including the future Henry II of England, who would be the first king of the Plantagenet dynasty. Matilda's son Henry was crowned king, and she was able to secure her position as the most powerful woman in England. But he wasn't successful, and he actually died in 1150 during the siege of Normandy, and his older brother, Frederick, died before him. And so this meant that the only surviving Plantagenet heir was Matilda, the daughter of Henry II and niece of King Stephen, because she thought that her daughter-in-law would be too powerful, and she wanted to keep as much power in the family as possible. For example, when Henry II was in Aquitaine putting down a rebellion, Matilda acted as regent in his stead. He allowed her to manage the royal household, and she took control of the finances and appointed royal officials. But others criticized her for overstepping her bounds and trying to run the country. She was even involved in the administration of justice and heard appeals that were brought before her. And so Matilda sided with Richard, hoping that he would make her his heir. And when Henry III came to power, he stripped her of her titles and possessions. And when he died in 1189, she oversaw the coronation of his eldest son, also named Henry, as king. Even in her final years, when she had lost most of her power and prestige, she was still plotting and scheming, trying to regain what she had lost. And though she was never tried, she spent the rest of her days in prison, and she died in 1199. Another time, when Henry II was trying to impose order on his unruly court, Matilda defended her favorite son, Richard, who was known for his hot temper and violent behavior. She was given that title not because she was married to the king, but because she was the dominant force in English politics in the mid-1100s. You see, when Henry III came to power, he was eager to assert his authority, and he didn't want anyone, especially not his mother, undermining him. But her legacy lived on in her descendants, the Plantagenets, who would go on to rule England for more than 300 years. He extended royal authority into Ireland and began the conquest of Wales, but he also had a difficult relationship with his mother. However, this was unpopular with many of the barons who felt that a woman was not fit to be monarch, and he immediately marched on the barons to let them know that he was not happy about what they had done. So she was not afraid to speak her mind or make her own decisions, even if they went against her son's wishes, and that Henry should name his younger brother, the Bishop of Winchester, as his heir instead. And this is where things get really interesting. Who is she? This is Empress Matilda, and her mother died soon after Matilda was born. So Matilda grew up in the Anglo-Norman court and was primarily raised by her father. Well, that is a title that is usually reserved for the wife of the king. But in this case, it was actually used to refer to Matilda herself, not because she was married to the king, but because of her influence over him. Instead, they chose Stephen, the nephew of Henry I and the brother of the previous king, Stephen, to be king. And so began the civil war known as the Anarchy, which lasted for 20 years. You see, their relationship was an unusual one, and though he doted on his daughter and wanted the best for her, he was also incredibly controlling and even overbearing at times. When you think of powerful women in medieval history, names like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of France may spring to mind. If you enjoy this series, please remember to support us through membership by making a one-time contribution or by buying some merch. And took her on a tour of his territory, showing her off to various nobles as the future empress. In fact, Matilda and Henry V never met until their wedding day, when they were both 18. Even then, they only saw each other twice before their marriage was annulled 14 years later. Nevertheless, Matilda would become the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. When she married Henry V, she bore him 2 sons, Frederick and Henry, and gave birth to 6 children in total. However, 4 of them died in childhood. These links can all be found below. Matilda was born in 1102, which is just as well because it's such a convenient number for a queen to have. Matilda was the daughter of King Henry I of England and his first wife, Matilda of Scotland. Now, you might be thinking, how did she become the Lady of the English? For instance, when Matilda was only 9 years old, Henry betrothed her to his cousin, Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Even though Matilda had left England to live in Germany with her husband, she still spent a lot of time away from him, you see. King Stephen died in 1135, and there was no surviving male heir. And here is where Matilda gets the nickname Lady of the English. But it didn't take long for Henry I to realize that his daughter had been tricked and coerced into signing this document. Meanwhile, when Henry I died in 1135, the barons went back on their word and refused to allow Matilda to inherit the throne. During this time, England was divided into two factions, one supporting the deposed heir, Matilda, and the other supporting the new king, Stephen. However, in 1147, the young King Henry, son of Matilda and the Holy Roman Emperor, came to England to try to secure the throne for his mother. Now, after her brother's death, Stephen seized more power and defeated the Empress's forces. In fact, he invited her to his court where he publicly acknowledged her as his heir, granted her estates in Normandy, so now we can see why she was called the Lady of the English. In fact, when King Stephen died in 1154, there was no contest for the crown. You see, when Henry II came of age, he set out to build a strong monarchy and was successful in doing so. After all, she had lived through years of war and hardship, and she knew that she had to be tough in order to survive. For example, when Henry II wanted to marry the heiress of Aquitaine, Matilda vetoed the match. Despite their disagreements, however, the two worked together to further the interests of their family. Unfortunately, this new King Henry proved to be unfit to rule and relied heavily on his mother to handle royal business. Now, some people liked her involvement because they thought that she was fair and impartial, and as if that wasn't enough, when Richard the Lionheart came back from the Third Crusade, he started planning to seize the throne from his younger brother. However, the plot failed and Richard ended up in prison, and while she was able to negotiate his release, her reputation was ruined. It seems that throughout Matilda's life, she couldn't ever fully trust anyone and always felt like she had to be on guard. And in the end, it was this paranoia that may have led to a downfall. So in 1191, he had her arrested and charged her with treason. So despite being the most powerful woman in England for decades, Matilda was ultimately brought low by her own family. What do you think? Was Matilda a victim of circumstance, or was she simply too ambitious and power-hungry? Let me know in the comments section below. So, who were the Plantagenets? Well, it helps if we start at the beginning with this lady Empress Matilda, matriarch of the entire Plantagenet dynasty. Now, as we already know, the dynasty started with the man considered to be the first true king of England, King Henry II. And while she isn't a Plantagenet herself, she is the mother of the dynasty's founder. So we have to start here. But somewhere between 1114 and 1118, King Henry had both of Matilda's sons taken from her and raised in the English court. And this meant that Matilda returned to England as a young widow at the age of 45. Yep, this lady was no spring chicken. So he named Matilda as his official heir. This made her the first woman ever to be named an English monarch's heir. And finally, in 1127, she was crowned the heir apparent of England. And this marriage secured the alliance of one of the most powerful families in France. Together, the couple had 3 sons, the eldest of whom would become King Henry II. And because they were the parents of Henry II, they are considered to be the first Plantagenet. So in 1150, Geoffrey and Matilda had their first son and the future King of England, also named Henry. Then 4 years later, they had another son named Richard, the future Richard the Lionheart. Finally, in 1155, they had their third son, the infamous King John. So in total, Henry and Geoffrey had 5 sons, 3 of whom would become kings. So it seemed that everything was finally going her way, but it all went downhill from here. And to make matters worse, the royal family started to fall apart. First, Geoffrey tried to divorce his wife, but she refused. So he sailed back to Anjou and left Matilda to fend for herself in England. But things were looking so bleak that even her supporters started to abandon her, and her cousin Steve-O was getting close to winning the war. But then in 1153, Stephen fell ill and died. His heir, his son, King David, was too young to rule, so he was placed under the regency of his uncle, William de Ypres, Earl of Gloucester. But William de Ypres was pro-Matilda, which meant that the royal family was back in power, and soon after, Matilda and Henry were able to take control of most of southern England. After that, Henry finally came of age and they were able to negotiate a peace treaty with David. They agreed that Henry would take the throne upon David's death. So then David lived out the rest of his days as a cleric and died in 1155, and finally, Henry II became the King of England. Anyway, while Matilda had previously been hated by the English people because of the whole fiasco with Henry I, now they were cheering her on. So King Henry I died in 1135, and after his death, Matilda traveled down to Winchester to claim the throne. But once again, someone else had other plans. This time it was Matilda's cousin, Stephen of Blois, who seized the throne for himself. As a result, Matilda fled to Normandy to regroup, and this was the beginning of what is known as the succession crisis, or more colorfully, it was a brutal civil war that lasted nearly 2 decades and claimed countless lives. But Matilda fought hard for her right to the English crown, and despite being older than her cousin Stephen, and suffering from a recent broken hip, she assembled a loyal army of nobles and set out to conquer England. She was actually so successful that she spent 5 years touring the country, raising an army and naming her supporters to positions of power. In fact, she was able to capture most of southern England. But then the tides turned. Her son, Henry, who had been captured earlier, was ransomed back to her, but only to immediately sail off to Normandy to raise an army to fight against his own father. So then the war became a battle between mother and son, literally, as Matilda continued to fight for control of England and her son took control of Normandy, and it looked like she was going to be queen. But then King David fell ill and died on Christmas Day of 1125, so then it was just Matilda. Now, despite having zero claim to the throne, her fatherless half-brother, the previous heir presumptive, had fled to Normandy. So now the real power struggle began, while her eldest son, William, ended up living out the rest of his life as a cleric, which makes sense since he was a young kid at this point and his dad was the king. But according to most accounts, Henry raised his youngest son, the future Henry II, to believe that he wasn't really his half-brother, but rather his bastard child. In fact, there are rumors that Henry tried to keep secret the existence of both of his sons, which begs the question, why would he try to hide the heirs that could have helped him secure his dynasty? Some historians think that Henry had planned to name his brother, King David of Scotland, as his heir instead. Others think that Henry had a lot of illegitimate children and figured that one of them would eventually take the throne. And yet others think that Henry never intended to name either of his sons as his heir. But whatever the reason, it came back to bite him because in 1125, Henry I died and his eldest living son, not the half-brother, but his full brother, William, Duke of Aquitaine, also died that same year. This left the throne to Henry's second living son, obviously, except it was supposed to go to his nephew, David, but now it was going to go to the half-brother that he had kept hidden away for years. Of course, this is all speculation, but maybe Henry had hoped that he could keep his sons hidden away forever, or that they would die before him. But it seemed that fate had other plans. You see, Matilda was the daughter of King Malcolm IV of Scotland and his wife, Margaret of Wessex, daughter of Edward the Confessor, who was the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. So Matilda was born in 1080 and grew up in Scotland. However, when she was still just a kid, her parents went to England to seek out a better life for their kids, and they managed to get King William the Conqueror to agree to marry off one of their daughters to his son, Robert, Duke of Normandy, so then that made Matilda a Duchess of Normandy. That wasn't a bad gig, but unfortunately, both her brother and her husband died, leaving her widowed and alone in Normandy with 2 young children. Yikes. So she went back home to Scotland for a bit, but in 1114, she married King Henry I of England, thus uniting the English and Scottish crowns. This union gave them a strong base of power and was actually pretty popular among the English people. But it didn't last long because Henry and Matilda had a falling out, probably over control of England, and he sent her back to Scotland with just 4 shillings and 8 pence. Yeah, that's not even one of those new-fangled pounds, you know. So then Matilda took the kids and went back to live with her father in Scotland. But the story of the Plantagenets really starts with Matilda, Henry's mother, and the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. So let's get into it, starting with 1. Matilda of Scotland. Now this is where things get a little fuzzy, because there's some debate about what happened next. So now that Henry I was dead, his widow, Matilda, along with her father, King David of Scotland, marched on London to claim the throne for the rightful heir. In the end, though, King Henry I decided that he couldn't trust anyone else with the throne. And that brings us to 3. It was during this time that Henry met and married Geoffrey Duke of Anjou. But while Henry and Geoffrey were raising an army to fight against Stephen, Matilda's forces suffered defeat after defeat. As a result, Henry and Geoffrey Plantagenet can be credited with uniting the English throne. The Anarchy begins. As we ended part 1 with Henry I's death and his efforts to secure the throne for his daughter, let's pick up right there. Though Henry I had named his daughter his heir presumptive, upon his death in 1135, the crown passed to his brother, Robert, who became King Robert II. Why did this happen? Well, when Henry I named Matilda his heir presumptive, he didn't technically take her out of the line of succession. He just meant that if she never married, the crown would pass to her younger brother, Robert. At one point, the English crown was held by 3 different men: Stephen, King of England; Geoffrey, King of England and Ireland; and Henry, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine. He then proclaimed Matilda as a Lady of the English and held a coronation ceremony for her in Rouen, and Henry was declared the rightful heir to the throne of Normandy by the Bishop of Winchester. In 1153, the English barons invited Matilda to come to England and assume her position as Lady of the English. When she arrived, she had Stephen arrested and blinded, and she held a coronation ceremony for Henry. However, this didn't last long. Soon after, Henry and Matilda returned to Normandy, leaving Stephen's son, the young king, Eustace, in charge of England. The reason they left was because they didn't actually feel safe in England yet. Henry was only 14 years old, and there was no way that England would accept him as king before he was an adult. Historians credit her with being a trailblazer for women who came after her. Was she an evil queen or a feminist icon? Join us next time as we explore the life and legacy of this fascinating woman, or maybe something in between. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Author and historian Alison Weir says that Matilda sought to shape the future of England in a way that suited her vision of its best interests. In doing so, she broke new ground for medieval women and set a precedent for the role royal women would play in politics that lasted for centuries. Writer and historian Don Jones agrees with Weir, saying that Matilda deserves recognition for her intelligence, tenacity, strength of character, high political ambitions, and sheer bloody-mindedness. So Henry and his mother retreated back to Normandy to wait out the rest of Eustace's reign. Now, in the middle of this, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey, died. She raised money to fund military campaigns and led armies in battle herself. But make no mistake, even from her position of supposed retirement, she was still a powerful force in Henry's court. She was a renowned political strategist and used her knowledge to help Henry consolidate his power. Even after her death, Henry continued to value her counsel and regularly asked for her input when making decisions. It was said that if Henry was ever unsure of himself, he would ask his mother, "What would my lady mother do?" to learn how to handle the situation. Although Henry II certainly had his own strengths, it's likely that without his mother's guidance, he wouldn't have been nearly as effective of a ruler. Then, in 1154, 19-year-old Eustace died, and Henry was finally able to return to England. On Christmas Day 1154, he was crowned King Henry II, the first Plantagenet monarch. And expanding royal power, he would be the first to admit that none of that would have been possible without his mother. If not for her hard work in securing the throne for him, Henry II would not have been king. In fact, without Empress Matilda, there would have been no Plantagenet dynasty. She literally laid the foundation for an entire line of kings and queens that would go on for 3 centuries. From that point forward, the Plantagenets ruled England for almost 300 years. And yes, as strange as it sounds, this actually helped Matilda's cause. See, Geoffrey was known for hating the English and their customs. He had gone as far as banning Christmas and Easter celebrations in Normandy. The people of England weren't fond of him. But after his death, Matilda suddenly became the respectable widow. This change in public opinion was enough for the English barons to invite her to England and settle the succession crises once and for all. Now, despite having secured Stephen's submission and holding him prisoner, Geoffrey didn't actually want to rule England. He was perfectly happy with Matilda ruling in his place, since he hated the English. He also didn't actually see himself as King of England, but rather as Duke of Normandy, Duke of Brittany, and Lord of Ireland. What he wanted was for his son Henry to be crowned King of England. Unfortunately, the Londoners revolted against the idea of a foreign king and queen. They knew that Matilda wasn't French, but they saw Geoffrey as a foreigner, and they weren't having it. So they made an alliance with Stephen and helped him escape from prison. After that, things kind of fell apart for Matilda. Stephen was able to regain control of London and even had Matilda briefly imprisoned there. Eventually, Matilda was forced to flee to Normandy, where she lived in hiding for 5 years. Who exactly was king was often a matter of perspective, and if you couldn't beat them, you might as well join them. Many nobles switched sides multiple times throughout the chaos. However, it was very unlikely that Robert or any other male descendant of Henry I would ever take the throne, because Henry I also named Matilda his heir apparent. This meant that the crown would pass directly to Matilda if she ever married a male member of the royal family. In other words, Henry wanted Matilda to marry a man and then have a son so that her son could be king. As soon as Robert came to power, he tried to prevent this from happening by forbidding anyone from marrying Matilda. But after Robert fell ill on a military campaign and seemed like he might die, Queen Sybil intervened. She reminded Robert that he had sworn an oath to God that he would unhinder Matilda's marriage in any way. So Robert relented and allowed Matilda to wed. She married her cousin, Geoffrey, Earl of Brittany and Duke of Normandy, a few months later. The problem was that while Henry had been alive, Geoffrey had actually been engaged to marry Robert's daughter, not Matilda. Now that Henry I was dead and Robert was king, this engagement was seen as a threat to Robert's power, and he took it very seriously. In fact, Robert took it so seriously that he went to war with his own niece and nephew. The resulting conflict has been dubbed the Anarchy by historians, though it doesn't seem to have been called that at the time. Still, the name makes sense because it was a period of great civil unrest in England. Even worse, Robert was killed during the conflict, which left the throne in the hands of his son, William Clito. No one really accepted William's claim to the throne except Robert's widow, Queen Sybil, and even she didn't think he was worthy of being king. So when William died in 1153, Sybil switched over to Team Matilda. All this maneuvering left Matilda's son Henry in prime position to inherit the throne of England. But would people actually accept him? That's what the next few years were all about. March of the Kings. For the next decade, England was in turmoil as various nobles fought for supremacy. In 1141, Matilda's husband Geoffrey captured Stephen and held him prisoner. Throughout all this chaos, Stephen was declared the rightful king of England by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Matilda's brief rule. In the meantime, Matilda acted as regent for Normandy and became a powerful force in northern France. Legacy through her son. Once Henry II came to power, Matilda retired from public life and spent her days running a household and having affairs. Matilda died in 1167 and was buried next to her husband, Geoffrey, in the Priory of St. George's in Windsor. Influence and legacy. While her son, Henry II, is credited with many great achievements, such as reforming the English legal system in addition to founding the Plantagenet dynasty, Matilda was also an influence for female sovereignty in England, even if she wasn't able to achieve it herself. So, who was Empress Matilda? Now we're going to continue the story of the Plantagenets with a look at Henry II's first wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. And remember, Empress Matilda's fire burned through generations of kings and queens. Don't miss a single moment of the heat.